everybody. It's Dr. Newmark, and I am trying to record this in a slightly different way this week, so we'll see if it works. Anyway, this is week 2, and I'm going to talk about 2 of the 3 readings that you were assigned for this week. And if I tried to talk about all 3 of them ever in any week, it would probably just take too long. Last week's video is 20 minutes long. I'm going to try to keep this a little shorter. We'll see if I succeed. And because I'm going to try to keep it shorter, it's just going to kind of gloss over the top or touch on just some of the main themes of 2 of the readings for this week. In the future, there will be student presentations each week as well. I will also be posting a highlights video. And by the time I record my highlights video, I should have seen the student presentation for that week, so I can kind of cater what I do around what the students chose to do and emphasize some things that maybe they didn't emphasize, or if there's multiple readings, I can touch upon ones that they didn't touch upon. So we'll just see how that goes in the future. But without further ado, let's see if I can advance to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so I just want to remind you to read the prompt and view the examples for the scrapbook. You needed to do one for last week, and you need to do one for this week. You need to do one for every week except for the weeks when it's due. So be sure that you have a sense of what to do based on looking at the prior students' examples that are posted in the same item as the scrapbook assignment is actually shared in last week's module. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about John Berger or Berger. I'm not sure how you say it. I'll probably alternate between those pronunciations, chapters 1 through 3. You also read Kostelnik and Hassett's Introduction to Shaping Information, although I'm not going to talk about that today in class. And then, or in this video, and I'll talk a little bit about Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Okay, so this is an example from one of my past student scrapbooks. This shows that the student chose an image that they thought was evocative in some way and then provided an analysis of it. So just use this as a quick visual reference for what you need to do in each entry. This student did hers in just a Word doc as opposed to using WordPress, Tumblr, Blogger, whatever platform you want to do. I actually prefer that you use a web platform for it rather than doing it as a doc or a PDF that you upload to Canvas when you're done, but that's really up to you. Anyway, I just wanted to show you one example, and this is one of the examples. This is from my former student Sahar. So this example is in the course in week 1. Okay, so let's jump right in. Okay, so this book, Ways of Seeing, I first read this book in my first year of graduate school, and it really blew my mind. This book came out in the 1970s, and it is by John Berger. You can read about him. You can just read his Wikipedia entry. This is only one of the works that he's well known for. I actually know a scholar of D.H. Lawrence studies in posthumanism, just to like pull a British modernist out of the air. And his work on posthumanism, in fact, he uses the work of John Berger. So it's very interesting. It's much more complex. His philosophy, his approach as a cultural critic is much broader than just the sense that you're going to get from reading this book. But I love this book. To me, it's of time, even though the artworks that it studies are hundreds of years old and the advertising examples that he uses were of the time when this book was written, the 1970s. So they're clearly very old to us now, and we consume our advertising on digital media now, much more than we do in print media or newspapers. But I really think that the perspectives that he puts forth are still relevant and can really inquiries today. So as I say here on the slide, so this book's conventions, the very conventions of this book are challenging. They challenge our expectations. One of the things that I love to point out, if you had this book in hard copy, you know, you could see it and touch it. It's a really thin book. I shared with you a full text version of this online, but the text itself starts on the cover of the book. So he is really playing with the very materiality of the book as a medium of communication. Books have been commodified. We buy them, we sell them. Just the very nature of what's included in a book is dependent on the technologies that are used to produce it. So for a long time, you know, we could only print black and white photographs in the newspaper. Now color photographs are sort of de rigueur. And absolutely commonplace. And in the digital realm today, on websites, any kind of image can be shared, a moving image, a static image, a colored image. So not any kind of image, but there are limitations based on screen, but it's certainly much more referential and relies upon sort of a deeper understanding of visual information and can touch upon our sensibilities even more deeply because we're engaging with it in a much more multifaceted fashion. So what I'm pointing out is on the cover of this book, he plays with the modality itself by putting something on the cover that we would typically see on the inside of the book. Now, in the middle of your screen, you'll see a still from the title slide, as it were, from the television series that was produced in conjunction with Ways of Seeing the Book. Actually, I think the book came after the television series, but it was very popular in Britain. And what I think is really fascinating is the font that was chosen to put the words Ways of Seeing on the screen. That evokes like sort of modern computer technology in the 1970s. You know, this was certainly not a classical font. It was a new age or a technologized font that was certainly meant to convey something in and of itself. So there's certain questions that as a good technical communicator, you should absolutely ask yourself when you're interacting with any form of communication. And that is, who is this book for and who is its audience? So when you are reading it, I really want you to think about that. And think about also the fact that the television series was released on one of the only television stations in Britain at the time. I think there were just like 2 public stations. It says BBC 4, but that's just from a rebroadcast. I don't remember the actual like sort of the facts about how many stations there were. You can look that up, but there were not many. There were just a handful. And when I lived in the UK in the mid 90s, which was 20 years after this, there were just a handful, even though cable news was starting to take off at that time. Anyway, I digress. So let us move on. Okay, so this is one of the paintings that he discusses. This one's by Halls, and it portrays these regents who he makes the case that there was a great economic disparity between the regents that Halls was depicting and Halls himself. So I have on the screen some quotes from the text that I think are particularly evocative. And just to restrain myself from having this video once again be really long, I'm just going to read these to you and ask you to think about them. I could pontificate about them left and right because this is so interesting to me and I've read this book so many times and thought about it a lot. But here are some of the ideas that I thought were really powerful. So he explains that all images are man-made. Think about that in relation to oil painting, even petroglyphs or hieroglyphics or mosaics or any kind of image that you think of that you can interact with as a spectator. They are man-made. He says every image embodies a way of seeing. That's pretty powerful. That's the very title of his book. So, okay, yes, I say, the photographer or artist makes choices, as does the graphic designer or the document creator. What is important about the power of choice making? Everything that we interact with as a consumer of information is mediated. Maybe I should walk that back a little bit. But most of the things that we interact with in the realm of technical communication, at least, or professional communication, those are mediated communication. There's something in between the information and the consumer of the information. So think about that a little bit. So Berger discusses mystification with respect to the Hall's painting of the regents. He says, mystification is the process of explaining away what otherwise might be evident. So think about mystification. It's a really powerful theoretical term. And I have an arrow pointing here to this figure here in the painting that John Berger really analyzes in the painting. And he has a dispute with this well-known historian of Halls's work, and he disagrees with the way that that historian represents what is actually taking place in this painting. Okay, so Berger also reveals the crux of his analysis, which concerns capitalism. So how can his ideas about capitalism and images connect to the work of commercial reproduction, documents, communication, data visualizations, et cetera, in industry today? So what I have on the screen here is a pharmaceutical advertisement. in the United States, we see a whole lot more pharmaceutical advertisements than consumers in other cultures. So these products, which are intended to be life-saving, right, or life-improving in some way, they use a certain kind of mediation, a certain kind of communication to bridge the gap between the pharmaceutical technology and us as consumers. And that bridge across those things has to, in effect, generate money, because the research requires money in order for it to be propelled, and the consumers and the pharmaceutical enterprises, they are all engaged in this complex capitalistic relationship. I'm not going to go into the merits and deficiencies of that cycle, but visual information plays a role in the perpetuation of that relationship. And I have this ad on the screen which depicts a woman swimming, and there's text on the screen in front of her face that says, "Are you kidding yourself? If you still have high cholesterol, you may be in deeper water than you think." So it's a play on words about deep water, which is an English language expression meaning that you might be in trouble, right? And it's playing on this visual vocabulary of her being a swimmer. So there's a lot of things that are taking place in this ad that are relevant to people who work in medical communication or the pharmaceutical industry as a medical communicator. This certainly is an advertisement, right? It's not medical communication like the documentation that comes on a package of medication, the flyer that we get from CVS when we pick up our prescription. But nevertheless, it's using the classical rhetorical appeals to work on us as a consumer of information, of a product, and of healthcare. So we see that it's using statistical information, like the percentages that it shows on the screen. We see that it's using, and so statistical information would be an appeal to logos. We see that it is trying to lean upon the credibility of this company, right? And the brand name and the trademark symbol next to the brand name. Those are an intention of establishing ethos, which is credibility, and pathos. Pathos is the appeal to emotion. So all of these things take place in this bounded domain of this print advertisement. And it is in the larger dynamic, the larger network of these relationships concerning the way images are leveraged to serve consumers and producers. So I'll leave it at that. But Berger's larger argument concerns the way that images are deployed in the service of capitalism, making us feel certain ways as consumers. Okay, so we're going to think about the organization of the visual field, just sort of jumping ahead. So use of perspective and the organizing of the visual field have to do with perspective, and it was a very important innovation in the history of painting. And what was the impact of perspective? So I have two paintings here on the page. So let's see if we can perceive any of these ideas at work in a few paintings by early Finnish painters. As I said, I taught in Finland last year. So these happen to be two early Finnish paintings from the 18th, 19th century. And these are of Gustav Wilhelm Finberg. And one shows him, which is a self-portrait, and the other is a cityscape. I think this is Turku after a fire that took place there, you can see. But the painting of Turku uses this perspectival gaze, drawing the eye to a particular place in the painting. Berger goes into this, so I won't really go too deeply in it. And we can also see how the painter arrays himself within the frame of the painting. All of these things are trying to lead the audience's eye into the experience in a certain way, as forming a certain relationship between what takes place in the space of the painting and the experience that the viewer has. So I want to think about a particular kind of art form that is very well known in our state, Spanish colonial art. This is a retablo that we have on the screen here. You can see, because I used a screenshot, that this is a retablo by the 18th century novice. It's the name is what was actually on the website. I didn't include it here, but this is a Madonna in Christ Child retablo, which is a very, very famous visual trope for this genre of artwork in the 18th century. So 1700s, right? I don't know exactly when. So the value we see reflected in Spanish colonial retablos from the 18th century can be a monetary value, it can be sort of a spiritual value, it can have cultural value. It fits into a larger story of Spanish colonialism, which again, beyond the scope of this video today. But how does this relate to the tradition out of which this came? So this is often classified as a kind of folk art, right? Retablos, boltos, all those sort of Spanish colonial art forms, but they do descend in a way from the more quote unquote, and heavy quotes on this, high art tradition of European oil painting that Berger discusses, highly laden with class expectations, and sort of this caste system within the economy and the communities in which these artworks were being produced. And he mentions that with regard to the Halls painting. I put on the screen the price that this retablo is going for through a gallery in Santa Fe. It's an $11,000 retablo. I'm just, again, going to drop that there. I would like you to think about it, especially in light of what I said in the previous slide concerning the relationship that these highly prized artworks, even if they were folk art in their moment, this sort of capitalistic system regarding artworks and consumer and the consumer gaze. Okay, so I'm going to put forward this phrase, the digital afterlives of oil paintings. So what might this mean and what is its significance? So I got that image off of a website. I took a screen capture and then I cropped it and put it in your slide presentation. So that retablo does not only exist in one particular space, in one particular time, in one particular home. What does digital reproduction do to meaning? And this is something that Berger talks about on page 24. So in your view, do museums and galleries use the authority of their governmental affiliation if they're a museum, or simply their physical material presence as an imposing building, for example, to, quote, glorify the present social system and its priorities? It's a huge concept, and we could talk about museification more. But so original used to, and perhaps does in a museum context, evoke awe. Berger argues that mechanical reproduction has had a certain political impact vis-a-vis this concept of awe and aura. I ask you, what is it? What does mechanical reproduction do to this experience of having awe when you stand before a painting in its original form? Okay, so I should share this presentation in its slide form so you can access this dissertation if you're interested in it, but it talks about the roles of men and women in Finnish advertising. And I don't talk about it in the slide presentation, but one of the questions that this academic asked in this thesis is, relative to our experiences of the way men and women are portrayed in advertising, which is something Berger gets into in the next part of his book, and it is really important as our way of seeing descends from the historical practices that we've learned over hundreds of years as sort of, Euro-Western practices concerning consuming images. What would happen if you swapped out a man's face over a woman's face in advertising? How would that make the image somehow uncanny or uncomfortable? So think about that in light of this advertisement. So Berger's ideas about women's presences in society and in art are ones that I want us to explore in a culture-specific context and with a historical vantage of nearly 50 years since he published his work. So I picked this cultural example in Finland last year. Think about advertisements you see all the time in our culture, either local ones to New Mexico, or I know some of you aren't living in New Mexico right now, but ones that are particularly calibrated to touch upon values in a particular culture, or ones that are supposed to be sort of on a more pervasive level resonant with like the quote unquote American people. So let's consider this phrase that Berger says: to be born a woman has been to be born within an allotted and confined space into the keeping of men. So, and what on earth does this have to do with technical and professional writing? Well, I think that once you think about, well, I mean, there's so much that I could say about that, especially given the evolution of technical communication from having been a field that co-emerged with engineering communication, which was a highly male industry and discipline to where it is now, where like over 60% of technical writers are women. So we're just going to have to bracket that out right now. But Berger is talking about being born a woman, meaning having been born within a certain allotted and confined space into the keeping of men, as if women also exist as a possession within a capitalist system. That's part of his larger argument, and you'll see that borne out more clearly in the later part of this book. So the last I'm going to touch on in this video is Walter Benjamin. And this was a huge inspiration for Berger in his book. So the work that he's most interested in is this essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. We live in sort of, I don't know, end times of mechanical reproduction, perhaps. I'll just wonder what you think about that phrase. So mechanical reproduction of art was in his time, the time when Benjamin was writing this, in the early part of the 20th century, was something new. So we are at a dramatically advanced stage of what Valéry identified as visual or auditory images appear and disappear at a simple movement of the hand, hardly more than a sign. And that's sort of a reference to semiotics there. But I mean, they couldn't imagine, they couldn't have foreseen how that statement has been taken to an extreme degree in the era in which we live today. Visual or auditory images appear and disappear at a simple movement of the hand, hardly more than a sign. And if we think about the quickness, the reproducibility with which we generate, revise, deploy, and then iterate that cycle again in technical communication with the graphics or the diagrams or the single sourced information for many different kinds of manuals over time, these things just appear and disappear at a simple movement of the hand, hardly more than a sign. A sign is a much more complicated topic, which we're going to be dealing with in the next few weeks, but that is such a powerful idea relative to the work that we do. So original works of art are tied to specific times and places. They really are. They were created by specific people at a specific time in a specific place. These create their authenticity. Now, in this digital age in which we live, especially with the increasing usage of AI tools, we can really question this concept of authenticity, and we can scratch our heads over the very notion of aura. Can it exist in something that is created, deployed, used, reused, recycled in a solely digital environment? What happens to this concept of the originary nature of artwork and aura? So Benjamin writes, mechanical reproduction emancipates the art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. Mechanical reproduction allows images to be reproduced in the service of politics. Again, a huge topic, which we don't really have time in this video to explore. And this, I believe, is the last slide. So to conclude, aren't technical and professional communication outputs at their core about mechanical reproduction or simply reproducibility? And think about the way images are used in these, which is super important. And that lies at the core of how a class like this is situated within like our graduate certificate in Tech Comm. It's really important to understand the functionality of images within the work that technical communicators do. So this especially applies to technical communication as opposed to professional communication. If you want to really pursue that within your brain, what those differences between technical and professional communication are, be my guest. So how true it is that media images, the apex of mechanical reproduction in our era, are consumed by the public collectively in a state of distraction. That's a quote from Benjamin. Or is that a quote from Berger? I don't remember. I forgot to cite it on the slide. Bad practice on my part. So professional and technical communicators attempt to break through humans' distractibility, not by sharing textual and image-based text that creates an aura, but by sharing textual and image-based information that sparks engagement and interest. And you saw that in that pharmaceutical advertisement. It's trying to stop you or even stop your scrolling using common parlance of today and spark your engagement and interest, probably by using one of the classical rhetorical appeals of pathos, ethos, or logos. So the public is an examiner but an absent-minded one. So I'll leave you with that last quote, and I am going to end this video here. I'm going to stop this share, and I'm going to thank you for hanging in there with me for this video. Again, probably a really long one, but I hope you enjoy your week's reading, and I will check in again next week with you. Thanks.